Hey everyone! Tonight we're exploring Greek mythology through one powerful story of love and loss. We'll witness a mother's desperate search across the dying earth, see the moment when eternal spring first turned to winter, and discover how the deepest grief can reshape the very fabric of the world. What time is it where you are as these ancient stories find you? Comment below, and if you're ready for this gentle tale, a like helps other dreamers find it too. Now get comfortable and let's begin with a meadow where flowers bloom forever. In the beginning, there was no winter. This truth seems impossible now. In a world where frost bites at tender shoots and snow blankets the earth in silence. But long ago, when the gods were young and their power flowed freely through the world, there existed only one season. Spring eternal, spring without end, spring as the divine heart intended it to be. The world knew only this endless flowering, this perpetual awakening that bloomed under the loving care of Demeter, goddess of the harvest and all growing things. This was not the brief, hurried spring that mortals know today, those few precious weeks between winter's death and summer's heat. This was spring as it was meant to be, inexhaustible, perfect, generous beyond all measure. Imagine fields of golden wheat that stretched beyond every horizon, their stalks never bending beneath storms, because storms had no place in this gentle world. The grain grew heavy and full, but never rotted, never fell to disease or blight. Farmers could walk among these fields and know that their work was blessed, that abundance was as certain as sunrise. Picture apple orchards where the trees bent low with fruit that never fell, never knew the touch of worm or weather. Each apple was perfect, its skin glowing with health, its flesh sweet as honey. Children could pluck them freely, and still the branches would be full the next morning, as if the very act of sharing multiplied the blessing. Olive groves stretched silver green across hillsides, their ancient trunks thick with the wisdom of centuries, their branches heavy with fruit that pressed into oil so pure it seemed to hold sunlight itself. Villages nestled in valleys where gardens grew without tending, where every seed planted yielded not just a harvest, but a miracle. Rivers ran clear and sweet, their waters perfect for drinking, their banks lined with willows whose leaves whispered secrets to the wind. The willows never shed those leaves, never knew the barrenness of winter branches. Instead, they grew fuller with each passing day, their green cascade providing shepherds and their flocks. Mothers would step outside their doors in the morning to find fruit trees heavy with whatever their families needed most. A sick child would wake to find fig trees outside the window, their purple fruit ready to restore strength. A wedding celebration would discover grapevines suddenly heavy with the sweetest fruit, ready to be pressed into wine for toasts and joy. It was a world where want was a concept that existed in no language, where hunger was a word that would have puzzled the wisest philosophers. The very air hummed with abundance, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, and the promise that tomorrow would bring even greater wonders than today. Demeter herself walked among the mortals in those days, not distant and terrible like her brother Zeus with his throne of thunder, not mysterious and changeable like Poseidon with his underwater palaces. She was present, accessible, a goddess who delighted in the simple acts of nurturing and care. She would appear to struggling families as an ordinary woman, perhaps a bit taller than most, with eyes that held the deep green of summer forests. She would help with harvests that had never needed help before, share meals at humble tables where the food multiplied under her touch, bless children by smoothing their hair with hands that smelled of grain and growing things. Farmers would wake to find their fields doubled in size overnight, their grain stores overflowing despite having harvested nothing new. A widow struggling to feed her children would discover her single olive tree transformed into a grove, its branches so heavy with fruit they needed supports to keep from breaking. Mothers nursing babies would find their gardens suddenly bursting with vegetables they had never planted, herbs that grew in neat rows as if tended by invisible hands. The goddess delighted in these small miracles, her heart as generous as summer rain on thirsty earth. She took joy in the simple pleasure on a child's face tasting the first strawberry of morning. She treasured the grateful tears of mothers who no longer feared their families would go hungry. She cherished the songs of thanksgiving that rose from villages blessed by her presence. But of all the joys in Demeter's perfect world, none compared to her daughter. Persephone had been born from love itself, conceived in a moment when Demeter's joy at the world's abundance overflowed into something even more precious. The union that created her was not one of politics or power, as so many divine births were, but of pure affection between the goddess of harvest and a mortal prince whose kindness had caught her divine heart. From her first breath, Persephone had been extraordinary, not with the terrible power that marked so many godlings, not with the overwhelming presence that made mortals fall to their knees in awe. Instead, she carried within her something rarer and more precious, the gift of pure joy. She moved through the eternal spring like captured sunlight, but there was nothing distant or ethereal about her. She was gloriously, vibrantly alive in every moment. Her feet touched the ground with real weight, left real footprints in the soft earth. Her hands could be scraped by thorns, her dress could be stained with grass, her hair could tangle with burrs and leaves from her wanderings. But wherever those feet touched the ground, new growth sprang up. Whatever those hands brushed against bloomed more fully. The tangles in her hair became nests for tiny birds. The stains on her dress attracted butterflies that mistook the patterns for flowers. Her laughter rang across meadows with such pure delight that flowers bloomed just to catch the sound. When she ran through fields, her joy was so infectious that even the grain seemed to dance in her wake. When she sang, and she sang constantly, wordless melodies that bubbled up from her heart like water from a spring, birds would fall silent to listen, and the wind itself would still to hear her voice more clearly. She possessed an endless curiosity about the world that delighted everyone who knew her. She would spend entire afternoons watching spiders weave their webs, fascinated by the mathematical precision of their patterns. She befriended field mice and rabbits, learning their languages of whisker twitches and ear flicks, teaching them simple songs that they would hum in their tiny voices. She could coax the shyest flowers to bloom simply by speaking gently to them, her voice soft as morning dew. "Come now, little one," she would whisper to a tight bud. The sun is warm today, and there's a butterfly waiting to meet you." And somehow, impossibly, the flower would understand and unfurl its petals, as eager to please her as any devoted friend. Most mortals, upon meeting a goddess, were struck mute with awe or terror. But children flocked to Persephone wherever she went, sensing in her someone who understood their delight in small discoveries. They were never afraid of her divine nature because it manifested as gentleness rather than power. She would play games with them in village squares, teaching them songs that made their mother's gardens grow faster, showing them how to weave flower crowns that would never wilt as long as they were worn with love. She would listen to their stories with the same attention she gave to ancient trees, treasuring their small adventures as much as any epic tale of heroes. "She has the gift of joy," an old shepherd once observed to his wife, watching Persephone play with his granddaughter in a field of daisies. Not just feeling it herself, but giving it to others. That's rarer than all the gold in Zeus's treasury. His wife nodded, watching the young goddess teach the child how to make daisy chains that sparkled with their own inner light. She makes the world brighter just by being in it. That little one will remember this day when she's an old woman herself. "Mother, look what I've learned today," Persephone would call each evening, running through fields with her arms full of whatever wonders had caught her attention. Roses and lilies, violets and jasmine, all woven together in crowns she'd place on Demeter's head with delighted laughter. But it was never just flowers she brought home. She would arrive with her pockets full of smooth stones that sang when the wind blew across them, or leaves that changed colors when held up to the light, or small creatures that needed healing or help. A baby bird fallen from its nest, a butterfly with a torn wing, a field mouse orphaned by accident, all found their way to Persephone's gentle care. "The morning glories told me a secret today," she announced one evening, settling cross-legged on the floor beside her mother's chair. "They said they bloom earliest not just to greet the sun, but because they want to encourage the shy flowers, the ones who are afraid to open their petals until they see someone else be brave first." Demeter would smooth her daughter's dark hair, always damp with evening dew from her wanderings, breathing in the sweet scent that clung to her skin like natural perfume. "You bring more beauty to this world than all the flowers combined, my heart." "That's silly, mother," Persephone would laugh, settling back against her mother's knees with grass stains on her white dress and dirt under her fingernails that no amount of washing ever seemed to completely remove. "I'm just one person, but flowers, there are millions of them, and each one is perfect in its own way. Like the roses that grow in the Eastern Grove. They're not just red, you know. If you look closely, each petal has its own shade. Some are deep as wine, others bright as blood, and a few are pale as sunrise." These conversations could last for hours, mother and daughter sharing the easy intimacy that comes from complete understanding. Demeter would tell stories of the early days, when the earth was young and she had first learned to coax life from barren soil. She spoke of the satisfaction of watching the first grain fields spread across empty plains, of the joy of seeing mortals learn to plant and harvest, to work with the earth rather than simply taking from it. Persephone would share her own discoveries in return. The family of foxes she'd found denning in the old oak grove, how the vixen had allowed her close enough to see the cubs, trusting her with the location of their most precious secret. She would describe the way certain flowers sang differently in morning light than afternoon sun, how roses had deep, throaty voices, while violets whispered in high, sweet tones. "Do you ever wonder what lies beyond our lands?" Persephone asked one evening as they sat together in their garden, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Demeter felt a small chill at the question, though she couldn't say why. The evening was warm, the air filled with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, but something in her daughter's tone, some note of wistful curiosity, made her divine heart skip with unease. "Why would you want to know?" she asked, keeping her voice light. "We have everything here that any heart could desire. Beauty, peace, love. What more could there be?" "I don't want to leave," Persephone said quickly, sensing her mother's discomfort and immediately regretting her question. "I would never want to leave you, Mother. I just wonder sometimes, the way anyone might wonder, like when birds fly south in great flocks at the end of their season. Where are they going? What do they see on their journey?" "Nothing as beautiful as what we have here," Demeter replied, her voice more firm than she'd intended. She pulled her daughter closer, wrapping her arms around the slight shoulders. "The world beyond our borders is harsh and difficult, full of war and sorrow and things that would hurt your gentle heart. Here you are safe. Here you are loved. Here you can grow and flourish without fear." "I know," Persephone murmured, leaning into her mother's embrace. "I'm sorry I asked. I don't really want to go anywhere else. How could I, when everything I love is here?" But even as she spoke the words that she knew would comfort her mother, a tiny seed of curiosity remained planted in her heart. Not a desire to leave exactly, but a wondering about the great wide world that existed beyond the borders of their perfect spring. She pushed the thought away, ashamed of it, but it remained there nonetheless, small and quiet and patient. They lived this way for years beyond counting, mother and daughter in perfect harmony with their perfect world. Each day followed the same blessed pattern, and each day brought new small joys and discoveries. Persephone would wake with the sun, eager for whatever wonders awaited her exploration. She would spend the morning hours wandering through meadows and groves, afternoon beside crystal streams or in ancient orchards, always returning to her mother's side by evening. She had favorite places throughout their domain, spots that drew her back again and again. There was an ancient oak whose hollow trunk made the most beautiful music when the wind blew through it, different melodies depending on the direction of the breeze. A rose bush that bloomed in 7 different colors, each bloom more fragrant than the last, each shade representing a different emotion. Red for passion, pink for tenderness, white for innocence, yellow for friendship, orange for joy, purple for mystery, and a strange blue-green that had no name, but made her heart ache with inexplicable longing. There was a patch of wild strawberries that grew sweeter than honey and never seemed to diminish no matter how many she picked for her breakfast. A grove of silver birches where the leaves chimed like tiny bells when they touched each other, creating music that sounded almost like voices speaking in languages she couldn't understand but somehow felt in her bones. Each evening, Persephone would return home with stories of these wonders, and new ones besides. Demeter would listen with the patience that comes from endless love, marveling at how someone so familiar could still surprise her daily with fresh observations and discoveries. "I found a grove today where the apple trees are so old their trunks are hollow," Persephone would report, settling into her favorite spot on the kitchen floor while her mother prepared their evening meal. But instead of being weak, they're stronger than ever. The hollowness makes them sing when the wind blows through, the most haunting, beautiful sound. And the apples that grow on those ancient branches are different from all the others. They taste like memories, if memories could be sweet. "And what did you do in this singing grove?" Demeter would ask, already knowing her daughter had done more than simply observe. "I sang back to them, of course," Persephone would reply, her eyes bright with the memory. "And mother, they harmonized with me. We created music together, the trees and I, something that had never existed before. I think they were lonely. Trees live so long, they watch so many smaller things come and go. But today they had someone to sing with, someone who could hear their voices properly." After their meal, they would sit together in the garden behind their home, Demeter's arm around her daughter's shoulders, both content in the peaceful twilight. Sometimes they would work on small projects, weaving baskets from willow branches that grew specifically for the purpose, pressing flowers between the pages of great books where Demeter recorded the cycles of growth and harvest across the world. Sometimes they would simply talk, sharing thoughts and dreams and observations about the eternal beauty that surrounded them. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, listening to the evening chorus of crickets and nightingales, breathing in the scent of night-blooming flowers that opened their petals only to the moon. In all the vast cosmos, filled with gods and titans and heroes pursuing their grand destinies, there existed no love purer than this bond between mother and daughter. It was love without condition, without reservation, without the complications of ambition or politics that plagued so many divine relationships. Zeus might rule from his throne of thunder, commanding through fear and the threat of his lightning bolts. Poseidon might control the seas through raw power and the terror of his storms. Ares might inspire warriors through the promise of glory in battle. But here, in these gentle moments between a mother and daughter who treasured each other above all else, existed the truest power in the universe, the power of unconditional love. The other gods sometimes whispered that Demeter was too protective, that she kept her daughter too close to her side, that she was preventing Persephone from fulfilling her greater destiny. They spoke of the natural order, of how young goddesses must eventually find their own paths, make their own alliances, discover their own powers and purposes. Aphrodite would visit occasionally, all golden beauty and sultry smiles, hinting that Persephone was missing the greatest joys life had to offer. "Love, dear child," she would purr. "Romantic love, passionate love. These are experiences every goddess should know. How can you understand the full spectrum of existence if you've only known a mother's affection?" Athena, in her practical way, would speak earnestly about the importance of wisdom gained through independent experience. "Growth comes through challenge," she would say, her gray eyes serious. "A mind that knows only comfort and safety can never reach its full potential. The world has much to teach, if only you would venture forth to learn." Even Zeus himself, in his rare moments of grandfatherly concern, had hinted that perhaps it was time for Persephone to take on greater responsibilities. "She has power," he observed to Demeter during one of his visits. "Power that grows stronger each day. Perhaps she should learn to use it, to find her place among us as more than simply your daughter." But Demeter would only hold Persephone closer when she heard such talk, her protective instincts flaring like flames touched by wind. "Let them say what they will," she would murmur into her daughter's hair as they walked through their gardens in the peaceful evening light. "They don't understand what we have. They think love means letting go, but they're wrong. True love means holding tight, protecting what matters most. It means never letting harm come to those we cherish." "What is it they don't understand, Mother?" Persephone would ask, looking up with those trusting eyes that held all the innocence of their perfect world. "They think strength comes from struggle, wisdom from hardship, growth from loss," Demeter would explain, her voice gentle but firm. "But look around you. Does the grain grow stronger for being beaten by storms? Do flowers bloom more beautifully for being threatened by frost? No, my heart. Things grow best when they are loved, when they are tended with care, when they are kept safe from harm." Persephone, innocent in her joy, never questioned their life together. Why should she long for anything else when every day brought new wonders? She had fields to explore, flowers to befriend, creatures to help and heal, and always her mother's loving presence to return to when each day was done. The whispered conversations of the other gods meant nothing to her. She couldn't imagine wanting any life other than the one she lived, any love greater than what she shared with her mother, any world more beautiful than the eternal spring they tended together. She was, in every way that mattered, perfectly happy. But far below the sunlit meadows where Persephone danced among flowers, in the depths of the underworld where no spring could penetrate, another set of divine eyes had been watching. Hades, lord of the dead, ruler of shadows, brother to Zeus and Poseidon in the great division of the cosmos, had grown weary of his dark kingdom in ways he had never expected when he first accepted his crown. His realm was vast beyond mortal imagination, stretching through caverns and tunnels that honeycombed the very foundations of the earth. It was a place of incredible beauty, but it was the beauty of endings rather than beginnings. Silver rivers that flowed backward through time, carrying the memories of the departed. Forests of asphodels that glowed with pale, ethereal light, but never truly bloomed. Gardens of precious gems that sparkled in the darkness, but would crumble to dust if ever touched by the sun. Rivers wound through his domain with names that mortals whispered in fear. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, where souls could drink and lose all memory of their earthly lives. Styx, the river of oaths, whose dark waters bound even the gods to their promises. Acheron, the river of woe, where the newly dead came to understand the finality of their fate. Cocytus, the river of lamentation, where those who mourned their losses could weep until their tears became part of the eternal flow. For eons beyond counting, he had ruled this realm with justice and wisdom, maintaining the delicate balance between life and death that kept the entire cosmos functioning. Every soul that entered his domain was judged fairly, assigned to their proper place in the afterlife according to how they had lived their mortal days. The righteous found peace in the Elysian fields, where eternal spring provided comfort and joy. The wicked faced appropriate punishment in the depths of Tartarus, where their crimes were balanced by suffering that taught rather than merely tormented. His responsibilities were enormous, his duties never-ending, and he had performed them all without complaint or respite. Unlike his brothers, who could take vacations from their divine duties, Zeus often disappearing for romantic adventures, Poseidon spending time in mortal cities enjoying festivals held in his honor, Hades could never leave his post. Death did not take holidays, and someone had to be present to receive the constant stream of souls crossing over from life. He had servants, of course, the Furies, who carried out justice with terrible efficiency, Charon, who ferried souls across the river Styx, Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded the gates and ensured that none who entered could ever leave without permission. But servants, however loyal, were not companions. They performed their functions with dedication, but without the spark of personality that made conversation truly engaging. His palace was magnificent, carved from obsidian and decorated with precious gems that had been growing in the earth since the world's creation. Halls lined with silver stretched for miles, their walls covered in murals that told the stories of every mortal who had ever lived and died. Chambers filled with treasures that would have made the richest kings weep with envy, but treasures that were beautiful to look upon and nothing more. For what joy could be found in wealth when there was no one to share it with? The silence in his realm was profound, broken only by the whisper of souls passing through on their way to their final destinations, the distant sound of the rivers flowing through stone channels, the occasional howl of wind through caverns that had never known the warmth of sun. It was not an uncomfortable silence. Indeed, for many centuries he had found it peaceful, a respite from the chaos and noise of the world above. But lately, that silence had begun to feel oppressive rather than restful. Where once it had been a friend, now it seemed like a weight pressing down on him, reminding him constantly of everything his realm lacked. Life, growth, change, surprise, all the things that made existence vibrant and meaningful rather than simply eternal. Sometimes, when the earth above cracked just enough during earthquakes or volcanic eruptions to let through the faintest hint of sunlight, he would catch glimpses of the world of the living. He would see flowers blooming under Demeter's care, watch children playing in village squares, observe farmers working in fields that promised abundant harvest. He would hear the distant echo of laughter carried on wind that smelled of growing things, catch fragments of songs that spoke of hope and joy and the endless possibility of tomorrow. But these glimpses were always brief, always partial, like trying to understand a symphony by hearing only a few scattered notes. They left him more frustrated than satisfied, more aware than ever of what his dark kingdom lacked. He had grown accustomed to this isolation over the millennia, or thought he had. He told himself that duty was enough, that the satisfaction of just rule and the respect of his fellow gods was sufficient compensation for the loneliness that ate at the edges of his existence like slow acid on stone. He convinced himself that his kingdom's importance to the cosmic order made up for its lack of warmth, that the beauty of justice served made up for the absence of simple joy. He had almost succeeded in believing these rationalizations, had almost achieved a kind of resigned contentment with his eternal solitude. Then one day, peering upward through a fissure in the earth that had opened during a minor earthquake, he saw her.
Persephone danced alone in a meadow filled with flowers he couldn't name, their colors more vivid than anything that existed in his shadowy realm. She moved with unconscious grace, her bare feet barely touching the ground, her white dress flowing around her like captured clouds. Her dark hair caught the sunlight and threw it back in subtle highlights that seemed to shift and change as she moved. She was singing as she danced, some wordless melody that drifted down to his hiding place in the depths. The song was simple, perhaps something about the changing colors of sunset or the way dewdrops caught the morning light. But sung in her voice, it became something transcendent, a hymn to the beauty of living that reached into the darkest corners of his realm and touched places he had thought were beyond the reach of warmth or light. Her joy was so pure, so complete, that it seemed to illuminate not just the meadow where she danced, but the very air around her. She belonged utterly to the world of growth and possibility, as natural a part of spring as rain and sunshine and the return of migrating birds.
For the first time in his endless existence, Hades felt his ancient, cold heart stir with something other than duty or justice, or the grim satisfaction of maintaining cosmic order. He felt longing, sharp and sweet and utterly foreign, cutting through his divine composure like a blade through silk. She was everything his realm was not, bright where he ruled darkness, joyful where he presided over endings, vibrantly alive where he governed the dead. And perhaps because of these very differences, he found himself drawn to her with an intensity that frightened him. She was the missing piece of himself he hadn't known he was searching for, the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. As he watched her spin among the flowers, laughing at some private delight, everything about his dark kingdom seemed suddenly unbearable in comparison. The silence that had once been peaceful now felt crushing, pressing down on him like the weight of mountains. The shadows that had been his companions for millennia now seemed like prison bars, cutting him off from the world of warmth and laughter that existed just beyond his reach. The magnificent treasures of his realm, the silver halls, the chambers of precious gems, the rivers that sang with voices of eternity, all of it turned to ash in his thoughts when measured against the simple beauty of one young goddess dancing among spring flowers. A thought began to form in his mind, tentative at first, no more than a whisper in the depths of his consciousness. But once born, it grew with frightening speed, consuming his ancient wisdom and careful restraint like wildfire consuming drought-dry grass. What if she could be his? What if that light, that joy, that perfect celebration of life could come to live in his dark kingdom? What if those shadowy halls could ring with laughter instead of silence? What if the underworld could be transformed from a place of endings into something beautiful and alive? The thought should have horrified him. He was a god of justice, of cosmic law, and divine responsibility. He understood better than most the difference between right and wrong, between justice and desire, between duty and selfish want. His entire existence was built on the foundation of maintaining proper order, of ensuring that the boundaries between life and death, light and shadow, remained inviolate. But love, when it strikes a heart that has never known it before, does not pause to consult wisdom or consider consequences. It does not ask permission from duty or seek approval from justice. It simply burns, consuming everything in its path with the fierce hunger of someone who has been starving without knowing it, and suddenly glimpses feast. She would bring light to the darkness, he whispered to himself, his voice echoing strangely in the cavern where he stood transfixed. She would make the underworld beautiful. She would give meaning to eternity. Even as he spoke the words, some distant part of his mind recognized them as lies, dressed up in noble clothing. He told himself he was thinking of his realm, of the countless souls who dwelt in its twilight existence, of how they might benefit from her radiant presence. He convinced himself that he was considering the cosmic balance, imagining how her joy might transform death itself into something less final, less cold. But the truth was simpler and more selfish than these grand justifications. He wanted her for himself, wanted her with a desperation that made his hands tremble and his ancient composure crack like ice under spring sunshine. He wanted to hear her laugh in his silver halls, wanted to see her dance beside his rivers of memory, wanted to watch her bright joy work its magic on his realm of endings. Day after day, he found reasons to peer upward through cracks in the earth. Day after day, he watched Persephone move through her perfect world, each glimpse feeding the obsession that was consuming his millennia of careful control. He learned her patterns, her habits, her favorite places to wander. He studied her like a general studying a battlefield, memorizing every detail of her daily routine. He watched her wade through streams with her dress hiked up to her knees, laughing as small fish darted around her ankles. He observed her napping in the shade of fruit trees, her face peaceful in sleep, one hand pillowed under her cheek like a mortal child. He saw her talking to butterflies as if they were old friends, and somehow, impossibly, they seemed to understand her and respond, their colorful wings creating a living rainbow around her shoulders. He watched her coax shy animals from their hiding places with gentle words and patient stillness, saw her heal injured creatures with touches that glowed with soft golden light. Each observation only deepened his fascination. She was not just beautiful. The world was full of beautiful goddesses, and beauty alone had never moved him. She was not just powerful. He could sense the divine strength that flowed through her, but power was common among their kind. What made her extraordinary was the way she used her gifts, the pure delight she took in nurturing and helping and bringing joy to everything around her. She was kindness made manifest, innocence given form, spring itself walking in the shape of a young goddess who had never known a moment of true sadness or fear. And she was completely, utterly unaware of his existence. This last thought tormented him more than all the rest. She lived her perfect life in her perfect world, surrounded by perfect love, never knowing that in the depths below, someone watched her every move with growing desperation. She was as unreachable as starlight, as impossible to possess as the wind itself. Unless he did something to change that. The idea, when it first formed fully in his mind, was so shocking that he physically recoiled from it. Abduction, theft, taking by force what could not be gained by persuasion. Everything he stood for, everything he had built his existence upon, rebelled against such a notion. But as the days passed and his obsession grew stronger, the idea began to seem less shocking and more necessary. After all, what choice did he have? He could hardly court her properly when she lived in a realm he could not enter, protected by a mother who would never approve of his suit. He could not compete with the perfect world Demeter had created for her daughter, could not offer sunshine and flowers and eternal spring. But he could offer her something Demeter never could, the chance to be more than just a beloved daughter. He could make her a queen, give her power over life and death, show her wonders that existed nowhere else in creation. He could love her with an intensity that would make her forget she had ever lived anywhere else. The more he thought about it, the more reasonable it began to seem. She was wasted in her current life, her tremendous potential limited by her mother's overprotective nature. Under his guidance, she could become something magnificent, a goddess whose power rivaled any in the pantheon. And if she resisted at first, if she failed to understand the gift he was offering her, well, love could be patient. Love could wait for understanding to grow. Love could endure temporary anger if it meant eternal happiness in the end. He began to plan. It would need to be done carefully, when she was alone and far from her mother's immediate reach. It would need to be swift before Demeter could intervene or other gods could interfere. And it would need to be final. Once begun, there could be no retreat, no second thoughts, no mercy for his own doubts. He chose the day with divine precision, consulting the movements of stars and the flow of earthly time until he found the perfect moment. He prepared his chariot, harnessing his immortal horses, creatures of shadow and flame who had never felt sunlight on their backs. He opened a passage from his realm to the world above, a tunnel that would allow him to emerge exactly where he needed to be. And then he waited for Persephone to follow her usual pattern, to wander away from her mother's protective presence into the solitude where she felt most free to explore and discover. He waited with the patience of eternity and the desperate hunger of someone who had finally found the one thing that could make existence meaningful. Far above, Persephone woke to what seemed like just another perfect morning, with no warning that this day would shatter the eternal spring and change the world forever. The morning that changed everything began like all the others in paradise, with sunlight streaming through her window and the sweet sound of her mother humming in the kitchen below. Persephone stretched in the warmth, already eager for another day of exploration, another day of small discoveries and gentle adventures. She could hear the familiar morning sounds that had greeted her every day of her life, birds welcoming the dawn with their chorus of joy, the whisper of wind through leaves that never fell, the distant lowing of cattle in pastures where grass grew sweet and thick. These sounds wrapped around her like an embrace, filling her with the warm contentment that comes from knowing exactly where you belong in the world. But today, for reasons she couldn't name, there was something different in the air. Not wrong exactly. Nothing in their perfect world could ever be truly wrong, but different nonetheless, like a note played slightly off-key in a familiar song, noticeable only to someone who had heard the melody 1,000 times before. She pushed the strange feeling aside as she rose and dressed, choosing her usual white gown that moved like water around her legs and never seemed to show stains, no matter how many adventures she had. Whatever that odd sensation was, it would surely disappear once she stepped outside into the welcoming embrace of morning. "Good morning, little flower," Demeter called as Persephone appeared in the kitchen, her hair still tousled with sleep, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. "Where will your wandering take you today?" Persephone accepted the bowl of fruit her mother offered, peaches that tasted like distilled sunshine, grapes that burst with the flavor of summer rain, berries that stained her lips purple and made her laugh at her own reflection in the polished surface of the table. "There's a valley I haven't explored yet," she said between bites, her voice still soft with the remnants of dreams she couldn't quite remember. "Beyond the eastern hills, where I heard water singing yesterday when the wind was just right. I think there might be a hidden stream, or perhaps a waterfall tucked away where no one has found it before." The prospect filled her with the familiar thrill of discovery that had driven her explorations for as long as she could remember. There were still places in their vast domain that she had never seen, still secrets waiting to be uncovered, still wonders that would surprise and delight her. "Stay within sight of the sun," Demeter said, offering the same gentle warning she gave every morning, accompanied by the same loving touch as she smoothed her daughter's sleep-tangled hair. "And be home before the evening star appears in the sky." "I always am," Persephone laughed, kissing her mother's cheek with lips that tasted of morning dew and berry juice. She gathered her woven basket, the one her mother had made for her centuries ago, its fibers still strong despite constant use, and practically danced toward the door, her heart already racing with anticipation. The world greeted her like a beloved friend, welcoming her home after a long absence. Flowers turned their faces to follow her passage, their petals opening wider as if trying to catch more of her radiant presence. Butterflies materialized from nowhere to dance attendance around her shoulders, their wings creating tiny rainbows in the morning light. The grass grew greener beneath her bare feet, and the very air seemed to shimmer with joy at her arrival. This was the magic of her nature, the gift that made her precious beyond measure to every living thing. Wherever Persephone went, life bloomed more fully, more vibrantly, more completely than it had before. It was not something she consciously controlled, any more than the sun chose to shine, or rivers chose to flow toward the sea. It simply was, as natural and inevitable as breathing. She made her way across meadows where she had played since childhood, over rolling hills that had known her footsteps for centuries uncounted. Here was the grove where she had first learned to speak the slow language of trees, their ancient voices teaching her songs of seasons and growth that predated mortal memory. There was the stream where she had befriended a family of otters who still greeted her with chittering excitement whenever she passed, their sleek bodies diving and playing in water that sparkled like liquid diamonds. Beyond that lay the field of wildflowers where she had discovered that different blooms sang in different keys. Roses with their deep, throaty voices, violets whispering in high, sweet tones, daisies chattering like children at play. She had spent months learning their individual songs, then teaching them to harmonize, creating melodies that could bring tears of joy to anyone fortunate enough to hear them. Everything was as it had always been, perfect and eternal and safe. The sun warmed her shoulders with the same gentle heat she had known all her life. The breeze carried the same sweet scents of jasmine and rose, lavender and honeysuckle. Birds called from familiar trees with songs she had learned by heart over the centuries. She had no reason to think this day would be any different from the thousands that had come before it. No shadow crossed her path, no ill omen disturbed the perfect peace of the morning. Even the gods themselves, watching from their distant thrones, saw nothing in this day to distinguish it from any other in the endless spring of Demeter's domain. But far below, something stirred in the depths, and the earth itself held its breath. The valley Persephone sought lay cupped between gentle slopes, like a secret held in cupped hands, hidden from casual view by the careful arrangement of hills and trees. As she crested the final rise, following a path known only to deer and rabbits, she paused to catch her breath and look down at what awaited her below. The sight that greeted her eyes was so beautiful it took her breath away completely. Below her stretched a dell more magnificent than any she had discovered in all her years of exploration. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in impossible abundance, creating a living tapestry of color that seemed to glow with its own inner light. But these were not just the familiar blooms she knew and loved. Mixed among the roses and lilies were varieties she had never seen before, flowers that seemed too wonderful to be real. Strange blossoms that pulsed with gentle luminescence, as if tiny stars had fallen to earth and taken root. Vines heavy with flowers that chimed like tiny bells when the breeze stirred them, creating music so ethereal it seemed to come from another world entirely. Trees she didn't recognize bore fruit that glowed like colored lanterns, and their leaves whispered secrets in languages she almost, but not quite, understood. And there, in the very center of the valley, grew a patch of flowers unlike anything in her experience. Narcissus blooms, but enormous beyond belief, their white petals broad as dinner plates and glowing with pearl-like luminescence that seemed to shift and change as she watched. The fragrance that rose from them was intoxicating, like all the sweetest scents of spring concentrated into one perfect perfume that made her head spin with its intensity. Persephone descended into the valley like one walking in a dream, her feet carrying her forward without conscious direction. The closer she came to the magnificent narcissus flowers, the more beautiful they seemed to become, their glow intensifying, their fragrance growing stronger and more compelling with each step. She had never seen anything so perfect, so purely beautiful, so absolutely irresistible. They called to her with a voice she felt in her bones rather than heard with her ears, promising secrets and wonders beyond imagining if she would only come close enough to truly see them. "I've never found anything so beautiful," she whispered to herself, reaching out toward the largest bloom with fingers that trembled slightly with excitement and anticipation. The moment her fingertips brushed the silken petals, the world exploded into chaos. The earth began to tremble, gently at first, then with increasing violence that made her stumble and fight for balance. At first, she thought it was simply an earthquake. Such things happened occasionally, even in their perfect realm, when the deep powers of the earth shifted and settled in their eternal dance. But this was different. This was focused, purposeful, aimed at this exact spot with divine precision. The trembling grew stronger, and she could hear a sound like distant thunder rolling up from somewhere far below the ground, getting closer and more intense with each passing second. Then, with a sound like the world itself tearing apart, the ground split open before her. A chasm yawned where the beautiful narcissus flowers had been growing, black and impossibly deep, exhaling air that smelled of minerals and darkness, and things that had never known the touch of sun. The flowers tumbled into the void, their glowing petals scattered like fallen stars into depths that seemed to have no bottom. From that darkness came a sound that froze her blood, the thunder of hooves on stone, the crack of wheels on rock, the snorting and stamping of horses unlike any that grazed in the world above. Steam rose from the chasm like breath on a winter morning, if winter had ever existed in their eternal spring. And then they appeared. Horses burst from the opening like living shadows, their coats black as moonless midnight, their eyes burning like coals plucked fresh from a forge. Steam rose from their flanks as they climbed toward the light, and their hooves struck sparks from the stone edges of the chasm. Behind them rolled a chariot carved from obsidian, so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its wheels wreathed in mist that carried the scent of deep places and ancient things. Standing in that chariot, reins held in hands that had never known the warmth of sunshine, was a figure that made her heart stop with recognition and terror. Hades, lord of the dead, ruler of the underworld, brother to Zeus himself, had come for her. He was not what the stories had led her to expect. The tales told of a grim figure, harsh and cold as winter stones, terrible to look upon and frightening in his aspect. But the being who guided his dark chariot up from the depths moved with fluid grace that spoke of power held in perfect control. His face, though serious and marked by the weight of eternal responsibility, was not unkind. When he spoke, his voice was deep as the earth itself, resonant with authority, but unexpectedly gentle. "Persephone," he said, and her name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before. Not the bright, laughing sound her mother made of it, filled with sunshine and joy. Not the affectionate diminutives her mortal friends used,
warm with familiarity and love. This was something richer, more complex, carrying depths of meaning she couldn't begin to understand. She tried to run, her body finally responding to the terror that flooded through her veins like ice water. But her legs would not obey, trembling too violently to carry her weight. She tried to scream for her mother, but her voice caught in her throat, emerging as nothing more than a strangled whisper that would never carry beyond this hidden valley. She could only stand there, frozen by shock and fear, watching as the dark god stepped down from his chariot with movements that spoke of absolute confidence and terrible purpose.
"I have watched you dance among the flowers of the upper world," he continued, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel small and fragile as a butterfly pinned to a collector's board. "I have heard you sing to the roses and speak words of kindness to creatures that other gods would not notice. You bring light wherever you go, joy wherever you step, and my realm has known only darkness and silence for far too long." She found her voice at last, though it came out as barely a whisper, thin and frightened as a child lost in the dark. "I don't understand. Why are you here? What do you want from me?" "You are spring itself made manifest," he said, stepping closer with movements so fluid they seemed almost like dancing. She noticed that flowers wilted where his feet touched the earth, not from malice or cruelty, but simply because he was so fundamentally different from the world of growing things. Death walked with him not as a companion, but as an integral part of his very nature. "You are joy and life and beauty beyond measure," he continued, his voice growing warmer, more persuasive. "And I am offering you a kingdom where you could be queen of all you survey. Rivers of silver, halls of precious gems, gardens that grow treasures instead of flowers, power beyond imagining, authority that would make you the equal of any goddess who ever lived." "I want to go home," she managed, her voice growing stronger as the first shock began to wear off, replaced by a desperate, animal need to return to safety and familiarity. "My mother will be worried. She'll wonder where I am. She'll search for me." Something flickered across his face then. Sorrow, perhaps, or regret, or some emotion too complex for her innocent understanding. But his resolve did not waver. His purpose did not bend. "In time, you will understand," he said, and there was genuine kindness in his voice, as if he truly believed he was offering her something wonderful rather than stealing everything she had ever known and loved. "In time, you will see the beauty that exists even in darkness, the wonders that can only be found in the deep places of the earth. There are sights in my realm that no living eyes have ever beheld. Crystal caverns that sing with their own music, underground seas that glow with phosphorescent light, forests of silver trees that grow precious gems instead of fruit." "I don't want any of those things," Persephone said, and now there were tears on her cheeks, hot and desperate and filled with all the terror of someone's safe world has just crumbled around them. "I want my meadows. I want my flowers. I want my mother. Please, please just let me go home." "Home," he repeated the word carefully, as if testing its weight and meaning. Home is what we make it, child, what we choose to love, what we decide to treasure. Come with me willingly, Persephone. Let me show you wonders beyond your current imagining. Let me give you a throne beside mine, power over both life and death, authority that extends across all the hidden places of the world. No, the word came out stronger than she had expected, fueled by a defiance she hadn't known she possessed. No, I will not go with you. You have no right to ask this of me. You cannot make me leave everything I love. His expression grew sad, but not surprised, as if he had expected this response, but hoped against hope that she might feel differently. I had hoped it would not come to this, he said quietly, and there was genuine regret in his voice. But some things are larger than what we hope or fear. Some things are written in the very fabric of fate itself, woven into the pattern of existence by powers greater than any of us. He moved toward her then, not with the harsh aggression she might have expected, but with the inexorable purpose of someone who has made a decision and will not be turned from it by any argument or plea. Persephone turned to run, her feet finally obeying her desperate will, but she had taken only 3 steps before she felt his hand close gently around her wrist. The touch was not painful, not cruel, but it was absolute. She felt the power in him, ancient and vast as the earth itself, patient as stone and immovable as mountains. Against such divine force, her struggles were like flower petals batting against granite, futile and heartbreaking in their helplessness. "Be easy," he murmured, as he lifted her with careful strength, placing her in the obsidian chariot as if she were made of the most delicate glass. "I mean you no harm, child. I wish only to love you as you deserve to be loved, to give you gifts worthy of your beauty and grace." "This is not love!" she cried, pulling against his gentle but unbreakable hold, her voice rising in desperation and fury. "This is theft! This is cruelty! Love does not steal. Love does not force. Love does not take against someone's will." He paused, and for a moment she thought her words had reached him, had broken through whatever madness or obsession had driven him to this terrible act. His dark eyes softened, and his grip on her wrist loosened just slightly. "Perhaps you are right," he admitted, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it over the snorting of his shadow horses and the distant rumble of the earth preparing to close over them. "Perhaps what begins in theft cannot become love, no matter how pure the intention behind it." Hope flared in her heart like a candle flame in darkness. He understood. He would let her go. This nightmare would end, and she could return to her mother's arms and the safety of their eternal spring. But then his face hardened again, as if he was reminding himself of some greater necessity, some cosmic truth that overrode all other considerations. "But sometimes," he continued, his voice growing firm with renewed resolve, "what seems like an ending is truly a beginning. Sometimes what appears to be loss becomes the greatest gain of all. Sometimes love must be patient enough to wait for understanding to grow." The chariot began to move, carrying them toward the yawning chasm that led back to his dark realm. Persephone looked desperately around the valley that had seemed so beautiful just moments before, now torn and scarred by the violence of his emergence. She looked up at the sky, still blue and peaceful and innocent, where her mother's birds sang their morning songs without knowing that the world was ending. "She will never stop looking for me," she said, and there was both promise and threat in her voice, the first hint of the power that lay dormant within her divine nature. "My mother will search every corner of the earth. She will move mountains, drain seas, tear apart the very foundations of the world to find me." Hades nodded gravely, as if he had expected this response and had already considered all its implications. "I know," he said simply. "Demeter's love for you is legendary even in the deepest places of my realm. Every soul that enters my domain speaks of the goddess who holds the world in eternal spring out of love for her daughter." "Then you know she will never accept this," Persephone pressed, sensing some crack in his resolve that she might be able to widen. "You know she will never stop fighting to bring me home." "She will learn to accept what cannot be changed," he replied, but there was less certainty in his voice than before. "Love sometimes requires letting go, painful as that may be. In time, she will understand that you are safe, that you are cared for, that you have found a destiny greater than any she could have given you." "Not this kind of love," Persephone whispered fiercely, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. "Not the love between a mother and child. That love never lets go, never accepts loss, never surrenders what it holds most dear. You don't understand, do you? You've never loved anyone, never been loved in return. If you had, you would know that what you're doing is impossible." As they reached the edge of the chasm, she took one last look at the sun burning bright and warm in the sky above. She had never realized how beautiful it was, how precious that golden light she had taken for granted every day of her existence. She tried to memorize its warmth on her face, the way it turned the world into a place of color and life and infinite possibility. Then they plunged into darkness, and the earth closed over them like a wound healing, sealing away the last trace of their passage. Far away, in the sunny kitchen of her simple home, Demeter looked up from her bread-making as a chill wind suddenly swept through her open window. The bowl in her hands slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the stone floor with a sound like breaking crystal. The cheerful fire in her hearth flickered and nearly died, its flames turning pale and weak. Far away, in the sunny kitchen of her simple home, Demeter looked up from her bread-making as a chill wind suddenly swept through her open window. The bowl in her hands slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the stone floor with a sound like breaking crystal. The cheerful fire in her hearth flickered and nearly died, its flames turning pale and weak. For the first time in her immortal existence, the goddess of the harvest felt the cold touch of genuine fear. Something was wrong. Something fundamental had shifted in the world. Some cosmic balance had been disturbed in a way that made her divine senses scream with alarm. The very air tasted different, bitter, empty, robbed of some essential sweetness that had always been present. "Persephone," she called, though she knew it was still far too early for her daughter's return. The name echoed strangely in the suddenly too quiet house, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of tragedy. She moved to the window, looking out across meadows that had always been her pride and joy, fields where her power maintained the eternal abundance that had blessed the world for millennia uncounted. The flowers still bloomed, the grass still grew green and thick, but somehow it all looked different now, fragile, temporary, as if the eternal spring she had maintained for so long might, for the first time, face some threat greater than her power to overcome. "Persephone!" she called again, louder this time, and her voice carried on the wind across every field and valley in her domain, reaching into every corner of her realm with the desperate urgency of a mother's fear. But there was no answer. Only the sound of wind through grass that suddenly seemed too quiet, and beneath it, so faint she almost missed it, the echo of a young girl's cry for help, already fading into silence. The goddess of the harvest, she who had never known defeat, who had maintained the world's abundance through will and love alone, fell to her knees in her garden as the first terrible certainty settled over her heart like ice. Her daughter was gone. And with that realization, deep in the earth beneath her, something began to change. The roots of plants trembled as if sensing coming storm. The soil itself seemed to shiver with anticipation of what was to come. For the first time since the world began, winter was about to be born. In the depths of the underworld, Persephone sat on a throne of black marble, staring at her hands. They looked the same as they always had, pale, delicate, unmarked by any labor more demanding than gathering flowers. Yet somehow they felt different, as if the very act of crossing into Hades' realm had changed something fundamental in her being. The throne room stretched before her like a vast cathedral of shadows, its ceiling lost in darkness so complete it seemed solid. Pillars of obsidian rose around her like frozen sentinels, and between them moved the souls of the dead, not the terrifying specters she had imagined, but quiet, almost translucent figures who drifted past with the gentle purposelessness of leaves on still water. "You are troubled," Hades observed, his voice carrying across the silence like stones dropped into deep water. She looked up at him where he stood beside his own throne, noting how the darkness seemed to bend toward him as if drawn by some magnetic force she couldn't understand. In the mortal world above, she had thought him terrible, a creature of nightmare and shadow. Here, in his own domain, she saw something different. Not kindness exactly, but a sort of profound loneliness that made her chest ache with unexpected sympathy. "I was thinking about my mother," she said quietly. "She must be so worried." A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossed his angular features. "The separation is difficult. I understand this. But in time, you will find purpose here. The dead have need of a queen who remembers what it means to be truly alive.
She wanted to argue, to rage against the circumstances that had brought her here. Instead, she found herself watching a soul drift past, an old woman who moved with the same careful dignity she had possessed in life, her translucent form still wearing the echo of a grandmother's gentle smile. "They're not frightening at all," Persephone murmured, surprised by this realization. "Did you expect them to be?" I imagined monsters, torment, eternal suffering."
Hades followed her gaze to the drifting souls. Some arrive angry, some come filled with regret, but in the end, they all find peace here. Death is not punishment, it is simply the next part of their journey. Despite everything, despite her fear and homesickness, Persephone found herself genuinely curious. What happens to them? They rest, they remember, and when they are ready, they choose what comes next. He gestured toward the far end of the throne room, where a soft light glowed like dawn through mist. Some move on to whatever awaits beyond. Others choose to return, to try again at the gift of mortal life. She stared at that distant light, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not acceptance exactly, but the first stirring of understanding. "And you help them decide?" "We both do. A king and queen, guiding souls through their most important transition." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I know this was not your choice, but perhaps, in time, you might find meaning in it. Above them, far beyond the layers of rock and earth that separated the underworld from the living world, Demeter's grief was reshaping reality itself. The goddess moved through her domain like a walking wound, her very presence causing the abundant life around her to wither and retreat. Flowers that had bloomed eternal now curled inward, their petals falling like tears. The grass beneath her feet turned brown and brittle, crackling with each step. Trees that had never known autumn suddenly stood naked, their leaves scattered by winds that tasted of endings. She had searched everywhere, every meadow, every forest, every hidden grove where Persephone might have lingered to admire some particularly beautiful flower. She had called her daughter's name until her voice grew hoarse, had sent her power spreading across the earth in desperate waves, seeking any trace of the child who had been the center of her existence for countless ages. Nothing. No sign, no trail, no whisper of where Persephone might have gone. The other gods tried to comfort her, to offer explanations that might ease her torment. Perhaps the girl had simply wandered farther than usual. Perhaps she had discovered some new wonder that had captured her attention so completely that she had forgotten to return home. But Demeter knew better. She could feel it in her bones, in the very core of her divine nature. Something terrible had happened to her daughter. Something that went against the natural order of things, that violated every law that had governed the world since its creation. As days passed without word, her grief deepened into something harder, more crystalline. The eternal spring she had maintained through love and joy began to fail. Crops withered in fields that had never known want. Rivers ran low, their banks cracked and dry. The air itself grew thin and cold, as if the world was holding its breath in sympathy for her loss. Farmers came to her temples with increasingly desperate offerings. Mothers with starving children begged for her blessing, for just enough grain to see their families through this strange, terrible season that had no name. But Demeter could not hear them. Her grief had grown too vast, too all-consuming. She had poured her love into maintaining the world's abundance, but without Persephone to return that love, the wellspring had run dry. "She has to be somewhere," she whispered to the dying roses in her garden, their petals now brown and brittle as old parchment. Gods do not simply vanish. She has to be somewhere. But where? And how could she find her daughter in a world that grew colder and more barren with each passing day? The answer came from an unexpected source. Helios, the sun god, had watched her grief with growing concern as his daily journey across the sky revealed the spreading devastation below. Finally, he could bear it no longer. He descended to earth in a blaze of golden light, finding Demeter kneeling in what had once been her most beautiful meadow, now nothing but brittle stalks and scattered ash. "Sister," he said gently, his voice like sunlight made audible, "I have something to tell you." She looked up, and he saw how grief had aged her, not physically, for gods do not age as mortals do, but in some deeper way. Her eyes held shadows that had never been there before, depths of sorrow that made his own immortal heart ache in sympathy. "I saw what happened to Persephone," he said. The words hit her like physical blows. She rose to her feet, power crackling around her like invisible lightning. "Tell me." Hades took her. The Lord of the Dead opened the earth and carried her down into his realm. For a moment, Demeter stood perfectly still, processing this information. Then rage exploded from her like a volcanic eruption, withering every living thing for miles around. The very air seemed to burn with her fury, and the sky above turned the color of old bronze. "He took my daughter," she said, her voice deadly quiet now, more terrifying than any scream. "My innocent child. He stole her from the light and dragged her into darkness." "Demeter," Helios began, but she was already moving, striding across the dead landscape with purpose that made the earth tremble beneath her feet. "Then I will show him what it means to steal from a mother," she declared. "If he wants to play god of endings, then let the whole world taste what endings truly feel like." The last pretense of mercy died in her heart. If her daughter was trapped in a realm of death, then death would claim the world above as well. She would let nothing grow, nothing flourish, nothing live, until Persephone was returned to her arms. Winter deepened its hold on the world, and mortal prayers rose like smoke from dying hearth fires, begging for salvation that seemed never to come. In the underworld, Persephone had begun to find her place among the shadows. She walked now through gardens that bloomed with flowers of silver and pearl, their beauty strange but undeniable. She had learned to listen to the whispered stories of souls who sought her counsel, helping them find peace in their memories before they moved on to whatever came next. It was not the life she had imagined for herself, but she discovered, to her surprise, that it held its own deep satisfactions. There was meaning in easing another suffering, in helping lost souls find their way to acceptance and peace. But still, she missed the sun. She missed her mother's laugh, the warmth of earth beneath her bare feet, the simple joy of watching flowers grow toward the light. "You are growing stronger," Hades observed one day as they walked together through the garden of silver flowers. "More comfortable with your role here." "I'm trying," she said honestly, "but I can't stop thinking about the world above, about my mother. She must be so frightened." A shadow crossed his face, not the comfortable darkness of his realm, but something troubled and guilty. "There are complications." Persephone stopped walking. "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence she could hear something that made her divine senses prickle with alarm. From far above, carried down through layers of rock and soil, came the faint sound of wind across barren ground. No bird song, no rustle of leaves, just the hollow moan of air moving through emptiness. "The world above is changing," he said finally. "Your mother's grief, it has consequences I did not foresee." "Tell me," she demanded, her voice carrying new authority, not the innocent maiden who had picked flowers in eternal meadows, but a queen learning to command truth from those who would hide it. He gestured, and the air before them shimmered like heat waves, showing images of the world above. Persephone gasped. Where once her mother had maintained gardens of impossible beauty, now stretched wastelands of dead earth and withered trees. Snow fell from gray skies onto fields that looked like graveyards. In villages and cities, people huddled around meager fires, their faces gaunt with hunger and cold. "She grieves for you," Hades said quietly. "And in her grief, she has withdrawn her blessing from the world. Nothing grows, nothing flourishes. If this continues, mortals will die." Persephone stared at the images, her heart breaking. She could see her mother in the visions, wandering through the desolation like a ghost of her former self, calling out names that the wind snatched away unanswered. "This is because of me," she whispered, "because I'm here." "This is because of my choices," Hades corrected, his voice heavy with regret. I believed that in time she would accept what had happened. I did not understand the depth of her love for you." Tears tracked down Persephone's cheeks, the first she had shed since arriving in the underworld. But they were not tears of self-pity now. They were tears for her mother's pain, for the suffering of innocence caught in the wake of godly conflict, for a world dying because she had been too passive, too willing to accept a fate imposed upon her by others. "I have to go back," she said. "If you return to the upper world, you cannot remain here as my queen. The realms of the living and the dead must remain separate." She looked at him, seeing past the shadows that clung to him like armor to the loneliness beneath. He was not cruel, she realized, just profoundly, eternally alone. and desperate enough to steal companionship rather than remain forever isolated in his dark kingdom. "What if there was another way?" she asked quietly. "What if I didn't have to choose between them?" Hope flickered in his dark eyes. "What do you mean?" "The souls here, they don't stay forever. They rest, they heal, they move on when they're ready. What if I could do the same? What if I could be queen of this realm for part of each year, and daughter of the earth for the rest?" The idea took shape between them, like a bridge being built across an impossible chasm. Not perfect, perhaps, but workable. A compromise that honored both her duty to the dead and her love for the living world above. "It could work," Hades said slowly, "but it would mean change for everyone. The world above would have to learn to accept seasons, times of growth and times of rest, times of abundance and times of scarcity." "Change isn't always bad," Persephone said, surprised by her own wisdom. "Maybe the world needs to learn about cycles, about the beauty that comes from both beginnings and endings." They stood together in the garden of silver flowers, queen and king of the dead, planning a future that would reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. Above them, Zeus watched through eagle's eyes and found their solution acceptable. Below them, the souls of the dead whispered their approval, sensing that their young queen had grown wise enough to balance love and duty, life and death, presence and absence. It was time for the first spring to begin. The reunion happened at the boundary between worlds, in a meadow that existed simultaneously in the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. Demeter arrived first, drawn by divine summons she didn't fully understand, but couldn't ignore. She stood at the edge of winter's last reach, where brown grass gave way to tentative green shoots that pushed up through patches of melting snow. Then the earth opened, not violently as it had when Hades first claimed his bride, but gently, like a flower blooming in reverse. Silver light spilled from the opening, and through it stepped Persephone. But not the same Persephone who had vanished months before. This young woman moved with new confidence, her posture straight and regal. She wore robes of deep purple and silver, and in her dark hair rested a crown of pomegranate flowers that seemed to glow with inner light. "Mother," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there before, echoes of the wisdom that comes from witnessing both life and death, growth and decay, beginnings and endings. Demeter ran to her, gathering her daughter into arms that trembled with relief and joy. For a moment, they were simply a mother and child reunited after terrible separation, holding each other as if they could prevent any future parting through sheer force of love. "I thought I'd lost you forever," Demeter whispered against her daughter's hair. "You did lose me," Persephone said gently. "The girl I was before is gone, but what you found is someone new, someone who carries both your light and wisdom learned in darkness." They held each other as the sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth beginning to touch the earth for the first time in months. Around them, the first flowers of true spring began to bloom, not the eternal, unchanging abundance Demeter had maintained before, but something more precious. Flowers that bloomed because they knew their time was limited, that grew more beautiful for being temporary. "I can't stay forever," Persephone explained as they walked hand in hand through the awakening meadow. "Half of each year I must return to the underworld. The dead need their queen, and I've learned that there's honor in that duty." Demeter's first instinct was to protest, to demand that her daughter never leave her side again. But looking at Persephone now, really seeing her, she recognized something that made her divine heart sing with pride. Her child had grown up, not just in age or experience, but in wisdom, in understanding of the complex balance that governed all existence. "Then we'll make the most of our time together," she said finally, "and I'll learn to find beauty in the waiting as well as the reunion." As if responding to her words, the meadow around them exploded into bloom. Flowers of every color pushed up through the earth, their petals bright with morning dew. Trees that had stood bare and lifeless for months suddenly unfurled leaves of tender green. Birds returned from distant places where they had waited out the winter, filling the air with songs of celebration. But this spring was different from the eternal abundance that had come before. It carried within it the knowledge of ending, the promise that autumn would come, and winter, and then spring again. Not eternal, but cyclical. Not unchanging, but beautifully, meaningfully temporary. The world had learned about seasons, and in learning had discovered that temporary beauty could be more precious than permanent plenty. As evening approached, Persephone felt the familiar tug that signaled her time in the upper world was ending. She kissed her mother goodbye, promising to return when winter loosened its grip and the earth was ready for her touch again. 6 months, Demeter said, her voice steady now, touched with sadness but no longer broken by despair. 6 months, Persephone agreed, but think how sweet our reunions will be. She descended once more into the earth, but this time she went willingly, carrying with her the warmth of her mother's love and the promise of return. Above, Demeter watched the last flowers of autumn bloom and fade, their beauty made precious by its brevity. The world settled into its first true winter, not the harsh, eternal cold of divine grief, but a gentle season of rest and contemplation. Snow fell softly on fields that slept peacefully, knowing that beneath the frozen ground, seeds waited patiently for their time to grow. In the underworld, Queen Persephone sat on her throne of black marble, listening to the stories of souls who sought her wisdom. But now she spoke to them of cycles and seasons, of the beauty found in both endings and beginnings, of love that endures even through necessary separations. And in her garden above, Demeter tended winter flowers that bloomed in frost and snow, learning that love doesn't always mean holding tightly. Sometimes it means letting go, trusting that what is truly precious will always find its way back home. The seasons turned as they always would from that day forward, each one bringing its own gifts, its own lessons, its own perfect moment in the endless cycle of growth and rest, presence and absence, love expressed and love anticipated. And in the quiet hours when snow fell gently on sleeping earth, mothers everywhere told their children the story of Persephone, the maiden who became queen, the daughter who learned to divide her heart between two worlds, and the love that was strong enough to change the very fabric of existence itself. The world had learned to wait for spring, and in learning to wait, had discovered that the sweetest joys are those that come after patient hope, as regular and reliable as the turning of seasons, as eternal and renewable as a mother's love.